Review copy provided by the game's publisher. The first-person shooter. Surely one of the most popular genres ever to grace the gaming landscape. The rhythm game, an addictive niche that has enjoyed brief but undeniable peaks and troughs in popularity since its initial rise to prevalence in the mid-1990s. But what if these genres were combined? What if you could take the tight, satisfying gameplay of a modern shooter and merge it with on-point rhythm-based gameplay? Well, such a concept is no longer just a theory, as some crazy mofos over at developer Or Interactive have gone and thrown caution to the wind, betrayed science and all its laws, and Frankensteined the fuck out of these two seemingly disparate genres. If you've ever wondered what would happen if Doom 2016 had a love child with Crypto the Necrodancer, the answer is BPM, bullets per minute. And it's fucking glorious. So this is not only the shortest section of this review, but probably the shortest section of any review on this channel. Simply put, BPM has no story, or at least no narrative. I mean, there's a setting with named areas, bosses and characters, so I guess there is some lore here. But really, it's best to remember that these exist as set dressing for the gameplay, and key design philosophies on display. Still, it's worth noting that as somebody who normally places story and narrative high on the agenda, I found that within only a few minutes of playing, I cared little about their lack of inclusion. At no point does BPM, bullets per minute, pretend to be something that it's not, or get confused over what kind of experience it wants to create for the player. And given some other examples in the recent popular gaming space, this should definitely be commended. It is here that we really get to the meat of the BPM sandwich, as it's clear from only the first few minutes of play that this is where the game's core concept is being executed. Let's start with the basics. First of all, dashing, shooting and reloading must all be done to the beat of whatever track is accompanying the stage you are playing. Also, reloading is usually a 2 to 3 stage affair, meaning several presses are required in rhythm in order to just reload your weapon, let alone move and fire. This is the core underpinning of BPM, and drives the gameplay experience above everything else. In fact, I would go as far as to say that whether you can get in sync with this or not will really determine ultimately if you enjoy this game. Now, on this score, it's worth noting that the rhythm part of this game can be turned off, or at least the players need to interact with it can be. Essentially, changing these settings will allow you to always fire, move or reload on the beat regardless of your timing, allowing the player to simply play the game much like any other first-person shooter. While this adds great accessibility and also allows the player to enjoy the game's stellar soundtrack, more on that in a bit, I would implore you to not turn this setting off completely, and instead choose to use one of the more forgiving timing settings at first, if you're struggling. You see, without forcing the player to get in rhythm, all BPM ends up being is a pretty generic roguelike FPS with a great soundtrack. However, that's not to say playing this game as it was intended is especially easy. Getting the hang of playing an FPS in perfect rhythm takes some adjusting to for sure, or at least it did for me. In fact, things will probably start off a lot like this. But then until trust me, when it clicks, oh man, is it a rush. So I mentioned earlier that this game is a roguelike, so let me explain that a little more. Essentially, you play through a set of stages in the same order every time with the same boss at the end of each. But how those stages are laid out, the modifiers you gain access to, and the modifiers on the enemies, rooms, and bosses change every time. Also, when you start, you only have access to one playable character, but more become unlocked the more runs you attempt and goals you achieve, each of whom have their own special skills or quirks. On top of all of this, there is also chests, keys, and special areas and currency dropped in each room as you clear them, which allow for new weapons to be purchased or attained, new abilities to be unlocked for that run, or other benefits such as refilling your health. Unfortunately, while these are great systems that often engender fun and diverse gameplay, I do think they could use a little more balancing. For example, early on, I managed to get a run with unlimited chain gun rounds and a massive health increase. This meant that I was basically unstoppable and pretty much walked the entire game, stomping anything I came across, boss or otherwise, in seconds. While this was undeniably fun, it felt a little cheap, like I'd somehow cheesed the game without trying. Still, such balance will no doubt come in time, and for now, it's not a big enough problem to ruin the experience, especially when factoring in the diverse starting characters and difficulty settings. It's also worth noting that the shooting itself is not anywhere near as intricate as some of its inspirations, with basic constant movement and circle strafing being the order of the day here. Still, this feels appropriate given the complexity of meshing mechanics from two such disparate genres together, and the game never gets dull as you wait for the next beat to drop before a well-timed dash or shot. Unfortunately, while the general gameplay loop is good, the game's visuals could not be quite as highly praised. While they're perfectly serviceable, given the small development team and budget, it feels like a heavy use of filtering and contrast has been used here to hide certain imperfections and a general lack of coherence in the game's art style. Such a theory is further compounded by the developer's clear use of several art assets from Epic's ill-fated Paragon game, which were released for general free usage some years back on the Epic Store after the game was shut down. Alongside this, several other free Unreal Store assets have also been used. The criticism regarding the use of contrast can pretty much be applied to all levels of the game too, with each featuring a garish, borderline over-the-top single high contrast colour tone. This can be turned down in the options menu, however doing so unfortunately only serves to make the game's visuals extremely bland, and so only creates a new issue in place of the other instead of fixing it. Now, while all of this sounds bad, I want to stress that BPM feels far from an asset flip, and instead is clearly a very small team using limited resources to realise their vision. If the game was about telling an original story or crafting an intricate world, then maybe this would have been a little more egregious. But luckily the art style and assets simply exist as a means to an end, and that end is funky demon slaughter. Speaking of which, any problems that could be cited with BPM's art style can almost be forgiven entirely when factoring in its incredible soundtrack. In a game like this, music is obviously key, and everything could have fallen apart if this element hadn't hit the mark. Luckily, such worries are ill-founded here, as the soundtrack is nothing short of incredible, and even worthy of a purchase separate from the game, in my opinion. I mean, just listen to this. So let's start with replay value. Obviously in a roguelike, replay value is a core tenet that needs to be executed correctly, creating enough challenge and enjoyment in the right measure for the player to be challenged, but also to keep trying one more run. Now, other than the balancing issues I mentioned earlier, BPM pretty much nails this. Ever since first booting up the game, I found myself constantly returning to it between many sessions of other games that I'm covering. Headphones on, dead to the world, as if only myself, the demons and the music exist. It's a great game to play in bursts and never feels like it's demanding too much of your time, which is nice considering how much it feels like everything released nowadays is a mandatory 100-hour plus experience. While it can feel a little content light, more on that in a bit, it's fun enough to replay levels that this isn't too much of an issue, especially when playing in short bursts with gaps in between. However, while BPM is a game designed to be replayed over and over again, it does still somehow feel a little lacking in content, almost like early access might have been a more appropriate route. But not shitty early access, like good early access. Like Hades. But wait, that's out of early access now. Oh fuck, well you know what I mean. Bugs, on the other hand, are another matter. There is definitely some jank here, and while very little is game breaking, I've had the game crash once or twice, got stuck in the environment a few times, and also found a ton of other exploits. As an example, during the camera steal that introduces all bosses in the game, you can continually shoot the boss in question. This means that you get as much free damage on any boss as the length of the intro allows. If you get the right combination of perks and weapons, this can mean the boss is pretty much dead before the battle's even started. Still, while such exploits and bugs can be annoying or nerf the odd run here and there, they're not prevalent enough to ruin the overall experience, and many will no doubt be patched in the coming months. For now though, just go in knowing that a very small group of devs made this game, and it may take a little time to iron out all the kinks. When all is said and done, despite its clear flaws, jank, and lower production values, BPM achieves what it sets out to accomplish. Its crazy idea of a rhythm-based, demon-slaying FPS was high concept for sure, and could have gone either way, but its strong design direction and execution have produced a great game for fans of both rhythm games and demon-slaying first-person shooters alike. Sure, it could have had a more refined art style, more content, and a story, and its balancing needs a little work, but none of these flaws are enough to stop the sheer visceral enjoyment felt in its core gameplay loop. Add to that an extremely low price tag, and there's very little margin for error here. In short, if it clicks with you, BPM will have you coming back daily for just one more run. Headphones turned up, and distractions turned way down. You've probably slayed many demon hordes before across many other franchises, but I can say for certain that you've never quite done it like this.